All right, so in this next portion of our generative design module, we're going to circle back to some visual scripting. Specifically, this time around, we're going to focus on visual scripting for form generation. So you may recall in past modules, we've taken a look at the LandKit as well as Ladybug to start to do environmental analysis. So we looked at things like sunshade, slope analysis, elevation, drainage. And today we're going to look a little bit more at generative design tools, so how we can actually start to generate form using visual scripting. And we'll do this still using the LandKit. Specifically, we're going to look at the Paving kit. We're also going to look at Topo kit and Planting kit. And another thing we'll explore in today's module is how we start to circle back to our AI. So in the last class, we looked at Midjourney, DALL-E, and Stable Diffusion. And so we'll start to explore today how we might actually use those generated images to essentially spatialize or start to give form on a kind of site design or site planning scale. And so just really quickly to update you on the file, this has changed again a little bit based on probably where we left off, which was, in the Revit module, we had designated essentially a site boundary within the Gasworks site itself. Now what you'll see here is I actually have a bunch of different subcategories where I've changed my naming convention for my layers. And I'll circle back to this a little later, but these naming conventions from, topography and then areas is within topography. And then within the areas layer, there's actually another sublayer. In this case, planting zones, capital P and capital Z with a space. This naming convention is going to matter a lot for us with some of the free workflows that we're using in LandKit, where it's actually using a pipeline to reference the layer name specifically. So I just kind of want to mention that at the start, and I'll circle back to this to explain it in a bit more detail when we do explore things like the plant kit, for instance, which is what this relates to, the planting kit. So just really quickly to start, another thing I want to maybe draw your attention to is how we are scaling down, right? So we're at a fairly large site scale, and we'll do a lot of the work today at the kind of plaza scale here that I've shown. And that's just to optimize some computing time and things like that. I'll do the planting at the somewhat larger scale, but just so you can start to get a sense of the limitations also of the scripting for large sites and the amount of compute that it might take. So let me go ahead and showcase the first script for today, which is going to be a paving kit script. So here we go. We'll take a look at the paving kit example. And let me just split my screens a little bit here for you so that you can kind of see both at once. And there we go. And so really quick, this is ready-made, and I'll share this in the course canvas for you to input. So you don't actually need to do any of the scripting. You just need to assign the attribute. Sometimes here for the geometry input, you can see it's a closed, flat, or a trimmed surface. Now, in my case, I have here a rectangle that I drew. So it's one closed curve and it is planar. I drew it using the rectangle tool here. So I'm going to go ahead and right click and set one curve. And I may also just take my plaza layer here and hide it because as you can see, they're overlapping with each other, right? So that might cause just some visual confusion for us while I demo this. So I'm just going to click on that and type hide. I do have some elements underneath here for a different demo. So, this, just ignore that. It has to do with some TopoKit stuff right here. Could also hide that as well. There. So we have a bit of a better sense of the paving pattern just from the start. Now, what's really great about this tool, a couple things I'll demo is in the patterning. We have an option here to have a grid, which would be 0, running bond, which is 1, a hex pattern, which is 2, tri pattern 3, herringbone 4, and right now we're on radial, so we're set to 5. So I'll showcase each of those just really quick. A super powerful tool, in real time we're getting updates in terms of the paving pattern selected. Okay, so let me circle back maybe just to number 5, because there's an additional function that's really nice in 5, and it's this POB, so the point of beginning, which you can do by creating a point here and drawing a point. Let's have it be this point, and I'll right click here, set one point, and plug that in. And so now you get a kind of center point or point of beginning for this spiral, which is really nice, right? So you can kind of dictate if you do want this to come directly from the center like this, or like I had shown from one of these edges, if you want it to relate to the path, for instance. I accidentally snapped it beyond my boundary. Go there, right? So there's this kind of movement that we can actually start to use in terms of maybe how this path relates to this one or something like that. For my design, maybe I'll just move this to the center for now. I'll just eyeball it. There we go. So sort of center of the plaza. You could conceive of maybe even there's room here for a kind of tree pit and one central tree. So the other thing that's really cool about these features is here you can start to work through the length and width of your pavers. So in this case, the length, which is set to 2, but the default is also 2 and default 1. So you could start to make this, maybe we can make this 1 foot. And so right now, see there's squares. Maybe we can make this 0.5. If you find this doesn't update for you, you can double click here and you can change the decimal points for yourself. 0.25. And so now this will register a little bit differently for you there. So you can, of course, the lag is going to increase quite a lot for us here. So this is drawing way more pavers. These are more like European size ones probably at this scale. I'm going to go back to 2 and 1 because it is, for me, I can tell it's a little bit less lag, which is helpful. You'll notice also that you have this opportunity for the seam. So right now the seam here is 0.1. Again, let's see what the settings are here. We can increase the amount of decimal points by just dragging this over. If I wanted to tighten that spacing, now conceivably I could do 0.05 and see, you can see now that seam has tightened up for us in terms of the spacing. For the purposes of the demo, I'll just keep it how they had it as a kind of default setting. The other thing you may be seeing, of course, is the color, and that's dictated here by the swatches. So at the moment, there's kind of 2 ways. This is an merge that's plugged into the colors. You could take this mix, this is kind of a different color, but I may just make them world different, just so you can kind of really see a comparison. Take this mix, and so now you can see this different patterning with different colors, as well as the percentage mix, right? So 1, you can imagine what that might do. So it's all the first color. 0.25 will lower that percentage of the first color. And so you can kind of play around with that mix, or again, we can go back to this merge. The other thing worth looking at here is the type that we're talking about. So at the moment, it would draw a 0 type, which in this case is a curve. Now we probably would want this in 3D since we're working in 3D. It could be a surface, which is type 1, but let's go with an extrusion type 2. So that'll be a 3D element for us. So you can see those now in 3D. Our thickness, our default is 0.22 feet. So you can see that when we hover over it. Let's leave it at the default. If you did want to update that, I'm sure that's somewhat clear to you now that we could start to put in a number slider. If we wanted this to get thicker, to put it at 1/2 foot, so these will get a little bit larger. So now you can see the thickness is increased. I'm going to delete that and just let it go back to the default, a little bit thinner. So that's how you set up this script or how you input some of these features, but the preview is how you'd bake this out. So you would just go over here and hit bake. But I wanted to show a couple more things in this script that could be really great for you to use, because we do have 2 different functions here. We have a gradient curve color tool here and an attractor tool. So if you wanted to, let's say I was interested in starting to dictate through my paving design a kind of implied path through this otherwise flat field condition. I could draw something like this. And let me just pick that curve and I'll set that here, right click, set curve. So now what's kind of nice is you can start to create these implied pathways just through the paving design, right? So it's all flat, but you can start to connect these. Here you can start to edit out the distance, the thickness of these. You can just play around with these. So There's one kind of version of this. Instead of 8, let's see what 5 looks like. So that looks a little bit more kind of in scale with our work. What might be helpful just to show you is if I do 1 here as these other values come in. So now the offset distance is flipped to, and so this is something you can kind of play around with until you're happy with your offset. Like if I extended this drawing out, which maybe I'll just do this just to show you, because that offset still exists, it's just going beyond the plaza. So you can see there's a little hint here, right? So I've now pulled this far beyond this space, but hopefully this helps you see that offset. So it still does exist, it's just that distance has fallen beyond the drawing area. I'm just gonna hit undo on that. All right, and similarly, I could actually take this curve and I could also apply it to our gradient tool. So here, set one curve, and just swap this out. So you can see here that our C value, our curve value, will get put into here. And so now you're starting to create a different kind of gradient pattern based on this line. So if I hit delete, so you can see there's a kind of directionality to this, which also may be helpful, you know, if you're trying to tell a story about wet to dry, or something like this. Conceivably, you could also actually start to remove pavers, right? So if we did, let's just say we're happy with this design idea and go over here and bake. We'll just put it on our contour layer. And if I right click and go to rendered, so you can see these different colors. So I could also sell color, which is what I typed there, and hit delete. Let me clear these values and go back to shaded. So you could conceivably have a paving pattern where you're actually removing or almost dissolving into the landscape, right? So if I took my topography and moved this back in, or even if I typed show and got this plaza back in for me, now you might be able to have a tree and a kind of dissolving paving pattern. So that could be kind of cool for you. And so let me just hit undo on that, just because I don't really need these in my drawing plane. So that would be the first demo, which is the paving kit. I think it's really fantastic and works super simple. So hopefully that's all clear for you. Let me go ahead and hit show just to get this plaza space back. And so what we'll do really quickly is let me close out of Grasshopper and make this even larger because I want to show the topo kit option here for us to work in. So these are predetermined elements that I'll show you. You can see here when I click on them, there's the kind of path center line, you have your stair surface. So these are all pre-named. And just like I talked through some of the features earlier on here in terms of, you know, asphalt and concrete and planting areas, these also become really important for us. These specifically named like stair underscore surface, because what I'll do is I'll just go over here and I'll take our, let me make this a little bit smaller for us. And so I'll take the free topo workflow, specifically the Grasshopper file, which will be shared on our course module, and let's drag and pull that. Can download and install these, no problem. Close, close. And so what you can see, what's kind of interesting here, let me go to my shaded view, is we have this LandKit free topo workflow, and it shows up in this somewhat more user-friendly kind of feature where we can set some of the parameters, but really a lot of this is already laid out for us. If I go back to site, what you can do that's fairly interesting in this feature is, let's say you have this plaza and you're looking to grade it. You can start to take things like your break lines. Now I may just turn this off. I'll pause this so that I can start to edit some of these. And so, you know, we could take things like this whole back wall feature here, and I'll hit enter and just move this up. And why don't we turn this back on? And so you can see more or less in real time, this starts to update for us. Now, if we did want these paths to be able to connect with this topo, it's likely we'll want to delete out some of these. So there, now we have a line. Let me just refresh the preview. So that's a little bit more flush with our area. Now there are some other features we can play around with, like here you have the stair feature, which just responds to a kind of singular plane, which is kind of nice. So you can kind of rotate this, and in real time it tries its best to kind of grade in a topography. We do have this additional break line here, which you can start to pull to ease up this slope. Certain things here you do have to hit refresh preview. So there, refreshing that preview. Or here, for instance, we have some points, which I know this is a little bit in the way, but these are wall spots. So for instance, we could start to take our wall spots and move these up and have that topography start to update in real time for us. I think we have one more over here. Curious just to see. And so maybe we can start to take this and, you know, pull this over. So I think we're kind of at the limits maybe of where this can go, but you know, you could take the same logic on this side and start to pull your topography up. And so these are all just line layer names, and I'll show you on the back end just what I mean by like why the naming convention matters, because it's a little bit different. Oops, let me hit undo on that. So let me just refresh preview. So you can see now some of this topography, you know, if we move this line up, refresh preview. So now we've kind of graded into this space, and we can start to move this wall down. And so here, if you want to bake this out, you would just go out, bake features, or bake topo and curves. So that's one option for you. I'm going to close out of this workflow. And just really quickly, this is the actual script. So there's a lot going on here. Let me just see if I can find some, oh, here. So these are the pipelines that I was referring to earlier. So see, everything's organized by inputs. So in this case, features underscore curb, or not underscore, this is these two colons mean that it's part of this layer. So within the features layer, there's a curb underscore curves layer. There's also a curb underscore spots layer. So that's what the pipeline, that's why the naming convention matters. Because otherwise, if you name it something else, it won't know how to grab this geometry and move it into either your curves or your spots information. For instance, here, the spots is a fairly straightforward one. So it's just a kind of attempt at making something like this a little bit more user-friendly. But let me close out of that. Let me hit show just to get our plaza space back. So that's another way you could start to use TopoKit almost in real time to just update and test some of your topographies within this plaza scale site. Now I'm going to pause on showing the other LandKit one because it is kind of laggy. We're going to end actually this tutorial on the planting kit because it will take a little bit to load and stuff. So what I want to do is just hop over back into Grasshopper and we'll close out of this. We're not going to save changes. And I'm going to put this just on the side here, this over here, and drag this over a little bit for us. There we go. So a couple other ones that I'd like to show that I think are pretty interesting. The one, you may have seen this one before. This is a ready-made one, kind of an old classic, the Van Gogh script. In this case, more or less what it's doing is assigning a series of circles, which you can see here, through a set number of parameters to interpret this image. In this case, the image of Van Gogh. And so you can play around with things like this circle radius tuning, like what the largest circle is. At the moment, I mean, I can start to change these and you can see if things do or don't register. So here you go. Let me zoom in a little bit more so you can see that more clearly. So you can change these parameters. This is about the largest one and the smallest one. And you can play around and override these. I'm going to keep them like this just for the purposes of this example. So this is our circles. And this is our geometry, our sort of square, or a sort of a rectangle that we're working in. And what I think is potentially really interesting here is what I've done using Midjourney is I've asked the Midjourney bot to make a black and white parametric form in plan view. Now this wasn't very close, this first attempt. Ironically, I took the plan view out and I got things that were at least closer to plan, starting to play around with these kinds of forms. And so I decided to go with two, this one and this one, because I thought they were both kind of formally interesting. So what we can start to do now is if you right click on this and go to image, we can actually take these images and open them and start to create new forms. So you can in real time start to spatialize your design ideas. Let me just put a point down here so I can orbit a little bit nicer in this area. And so as you might imagine, you know, this, if you're doing something like the Michel Devine Kyoto rooftop, but you can start to use AI generated imagery to inform the spatialization of these patterns, you could make it for a really interesting site design. So here, you know, these could be a bunch of circles. If I was to take this and bake it out, these two things, right click, bake, let's go, contour is fine. And let me just move these over. So you could start to take this and we could start to run a curve Boolean on this. We'll hit enter. Make sure you keep this on surfaces. We don't want to replicate the curves. We actually want a surface output. And so there, see, now we have a kind of concrete plaza space where conceivably all the rest of these if I highlight everything else, control to deselect and do a planar surface. So all these circles, and maybe for the purposes of the demo here, I'll just switch just the color to green. Let me do that once more. Here, deselect, green. There we go. So these could be little areas that are planted or something like that, and everything else is more a kind of concrete plaza. And this form is informed by this. Similarly, let me just delete this one out. So that would be one way you could kind of work through this. Just for the purposes of this demo, I'll go ahead and swap the image out just to the other one. So we had tried this one, now let's try this one. So just another idea in terms of, in this one, you kind of can circulate directly through this, like through this kind of valley condition. And so that's kind of one way where you could conceivably I treated this as a ground plane, but you could also think about this as a general planting strategy. So the circles could also represent trees or something like that. So that would be one way that you could kind of work through this, which would be with the Van Gogh script. And I'll provide this in our course canvas. Close out of that, hit no. And so the other option would be to generate a height field. Oh, I didn't really mention, but the other one, that one was drawing from the origin. Height field, in this case, we could actually go back and draw this from the plaza. So here, for instance, I have, again, this contour that I drew in, which is just a planar surface. So let me take this mesh and hide it, and I'll select this closed curve that's planar and type planar surface. And so what we can start to do is take this surface, right click, and set one surface. And what you can see with the height field that's really nice is you can start to get points. And if you change your domain start value to something higher, you can start to make this a steeper topography. So in the last example, we played a little bit more around with how you might deal with a kind of planting condition or a kind of ground plane aperture condition or something like that. In this case, this may be used also to generate topography in really interesting ways. This is just the example it comes with, but you right click, image, and we can start to test these forms. So let's upload that one. And so you can see in this case, you have a series of points that start to make kind of really interesting pathways and meandering topographies or something like that, all generated from your AI image. Let me try the other one. Here, this one's more of a valley. Conceptually, I think this one probably works a little bit better for us. Maybe we can try around with both, but let's stick with this one for now. We can test both in the video, but the one thing about this script at the moment is our outputs are points. So in this case, our output geometry here is a point, right? So we can geometry to point. And what we would want to do from here very likely is a Delaunay mesh function. So Delaunay mesh. So Delaunay mesh goes in here. When we preview that, right now it doesn't look very good, right? This looks strange. Two things, the PL, we could actually go and we could take our surface, which is our plane. So here it's asking us for kind of base plane, which would be that. So we could drag that and pull it over here. Still not that much better. I think what we'll want to do is take our points and flatten them relative to each other. So let's try, yeah, flatten. Okay, yeah, so that's a little bit better in terms of the points relationship to each other. It almost originally was more like a bunch of serial sections. Let's see. So our output here is a mesh. It's this. Still pretty steep, right? Like this looks, it's a very cool landform, but it's not too reasonable in terms of a kind of topography. So we may want to just smooth that mesh out a little bit. Mesh. Let's try smooth. Ah, here. Let's mesh smooth that mesh. And we'll just plug that into here. Okay, so that's a little bit better. You can see here how in the Delaunay mesh, which when I click on it, it's in green, you have these spikes. And our smoothed one is a little bit more rounded off, right? So you have those high and low points still, but it's a little bit more balanced in terms of their relationship to one another. When we're talking about landform, this is important because it's a little bit more believable and buildable. We can, of course, play around with this a little bit by starting to up our domain. And let's see, let's go back. So these are pretty steep walls. I may go back and lower this a little bit. And so now, you know, we could take this mesh at this point. You don't really have to add this mesh at the end. It's just nice to kind of keep track of your components in some ways. Right click, bake. I'll just keep this on the contour layer. And let's just clear the surface so that we can look at everything. So this is a topography that we've generated then, which could be kind of interesting to generate form. You can see here. Conceivably, depending on what you're doing, you could also start to drape this. Or in this case, you know, if you have these edges, you can kind of control shift and manually start to stitch this into your existing topography or something like that. There's not that many vertices you'd have to do, so kind of a cool tool to get into site grading really quickly. And you could also go into this view and contour out some data. So let's just do like a very fine grading, like 0.25 feet. So now you have a whole set of contours where, again, you could actually just go into your top view, isolate this for yourself, and even start to get rid of some of these mega high points, you know, if you think that's not as believable. And then you could do a whole other Delaunay mesh, having just simplified some of these outliers for yourself. You can go back and see it's a little bit more mellowed out. So that's one option. I'm curious just to delete show. Let's delete this. I'd like to just test the other one. Let me grab the surface, set one surface. In this case, let's swap this image out. So here's our other one. Also kind of very choppy. Let's see in the mesh preview. Just curious to see how these look. We'll bake this out. And clear. All right, so there's another version. So we'll hit delete. And so let's close out of this. What I'll go ahead and do is save these changes here, and I'll share that updated one with you with the topography in it. Another kind of cool one that I'll share with you is just our make bridges one. So you could have something like a singular curve that you may want to, like, this is a little bit theme parky, but you know, if you wanted something like this. So this is just one curve tool. And we could take some of these and move them up. And we go to our fast bridges one. You could start to take this curve here, right click, set one curve, and you can build just a fast bridge that will start to make some interesting parameters for you. So we do have a little collision here. Really great tool, especially if you're doing like boardwalks and things. That's originally why this one was developed, was just to in real time make some quick previews. But you can start to have this in really crazy ways go. You can just modify some of these. So, you know, if we know that that's going to hit and have a collision, just pull on it a little bit. And there, certainly not ADA or anything like that, but this one, to bake it out, just down here, right click, bake. You can do that on contours. It's there. Kind of nice. You can change a bunch of things in terms of the spacing between the columns, the width of the overall bridge feature, heights of the railings, and all that, which is just all in these labels. So there, now we have this crazy way of experiencing Gasworks. So let me just click on this, undo, and we can delete this line here. We'll hit no on that. So the very last one that I want to show is the planting kit one from Land Effects. The reason I'm doing it last is just because it is a little bit laggy, and so I thought I would wait till the end to do that one. Again, this will be dropped into our course canvas, but what you're going to do is, for one, make sure you've assigned all your layers the way I sort of opened up this video, and specifically with the planting zones and things like that. But also underneath here, what you can start to see is we have a couple different layers. We have here the environmental boundary, which I've drawn, which is just the extents of the site projected to the C-plane, the construction plane. And then we also have the planting areas here that are projected to the C-plane. If you don't have that information anymore, I could say cell layer here. And I'm just going to hit delete on that. So if you only have these meshes, for instance, what you can do is just make sure you're drawing on your planting areas, and just here go cell layer, type dupe border, and then project to C-plane, to construction plane. Delete inputs, yes, and there you go. So now that's projected down and flat. Okay, so let's give this a shot. You'll see some other things that I've set up. So the environmental boundary, that was the full site boundary, the planting areas, which we just went over, and then these environmental layers. So this is the existing trees and buildings, for instance. That's what these are. So I've moved this over. And since we're just working in here, you can see there's context buildings out here. And I then also in my topography areas have things like paths, and in this case, the planting zones, which will be most important for us because that's where we're going to be doing our planting. So I'll pop over here and we'll go with the free plant workflow. Drag this over. All right, close. Go over to shaded. And so this one here, what LandKit provides you with is a CSV file as well. So you just need to hit browse and click on this and go to your ERA data. And this is kind of where the lag starts to begin, I would say. The other thing I would recommend is, the number of species I have set right away is 50. That was my mistake. Also, ideally, it wouldn't be set to 50 right off the bat. It starts to make it laggy. So what I would recommend in this case is to, let me see if I can pause this. Okay, so I've dragged this down to 20. What I'll do in the video is edit out all the lag time in this one, because there is a lot of lag time. And you can also start to change your locale. So where the default's PA, because that's where Chris LANDAU works out of University of Pennsylvania. We're working out of Washington. So we could go to Washington. And this is really the strength of the planting tool, is it will switch out now. At the moment, we're working with herbaceous plant types. And in real time, it will give you an update of the plants that will go into this planting plan that are no longer specific to Pennsylvania, but are specific to Washington. So we'll just pause again and let this load, and I'll circle back once it's done thinking. As you can see, we have an updated list of plants here specific to Washington. I believe there's also, things such as these buildings and trees start to inform things like sun exposure. So in these areas, I'm sure the plants will be slightly different, as well as here. Just really quick to give you a sense, here's the back end of this script. And so you can see, once again, the pipeline in terms of the naming conventions here and how that environment boundary starts to define this curve. Or here, similarly, how the topography underscore areas can create a combined mesh. And at the moment, we're still waiting for the planting data to work. So let me close out of this. As far as I can tell, let's go back over into the Grasshopper. So the environment. Cell size, topo. I wonder if the trick is, let's close this down. Why don't we try and close out of this and open it up again, and we'll see if that doesn't do anything for us. Again, you know, for me, the parameters here seem to be fine, but there's a reason I saved this one till the end. So let's actually close out of this. Let's definitely not save. And let's try to just open it again from scratch, free plant workflow. To see this unshaded plants. Again, I think the default should be far lower for load time. All right, and there we go. So all I did was close out and open this up again, and it seems to have worked. So sometimes, you know, it's hard to know the reason. I am curious if we can change this to Washington, if that's an issue for us. So let's do that, and we'll just let this load for a second. Okay, so it looks like the Washington one is working now as well. The lag is fairly intense. I think I am kind of at the limit in terms of compute, at least on my side. All right, so I think that lag let up. And we do have our planting palette here. And what's nice is I think underneath here, should be able to generate, over here, if I just click here and hide this, you do have a planting list as well. So you can see here the species and the amount that start to appear within the site design. Super powerful tool, but for the purposes of this demo, I'm not going to keep clicking on these because the wait time, the compute time is just a little bit too long. You could conceivably start to integrate shrubs or grasses and vines, or if you're very good with Latin names, you could start to actually select your plant material here from the list and make your own custom mix in this case. Or if you're willing or have really good compute, I think mine, because I'm recording as well, does make it a little bit more laggy, but you could start to drag this over and increase the amount of plants that appear in this planting area. And in terms of output, you could do your spheres or your circles and then bake these plants out. So let me just hit show. And so hopefully that gives you a sense of how to use some of these generative design tools in terms of visual scripting to start to think about planting design, start to think about topographic manipulation, landscape object form generation, such as the elevated bridges, and how we might start to integrate AI into a workflow for ourselves as well in terms of topography or planting design inspiration and things like that. So let's leave it at that, and hopefully this gives you a good sense of where we might go in terms of future tools for landscape architecture.